and welcome to Doubts Welcome, a ministry dedicated to answering your doubts, questions, and concerns about the Bible, God, and Christianity. Today, as you can see, we're continuing our Bible study series in the Gospel according to John, looking at John chapter 2, verses 12 to 25. Now, this is a three-part series, and this is part 2. In the first part, we talked about family and Passover. In this part, we're going to talk about the cleansing of the temple, and in the next part, we're going to talk about the prophecy of death and resurrection that Jesus gives at the end of this passage. Now, if you haven't seen the first video yet, that's fine, but I would suggest going back and watching it because, as I've said before, context is king when it comes to biblical interpretation. With that in mind, let's go ahead and jump into our text for today. In the temple complex, he found people selling oxen, sheep, and doves, and he also found the money changers sitting there. After making a whip out of cords, he drove out every one of the temple complex with their sheep and oxen. He also poured out the money changers' coins and overturned the tables. He told those who were selling doves, "Get these things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace." And his disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." So what do we got going on here? We got livestock and exchangers, right? But why are they here? They normally would have been on the Mount of Olives, and the reason why they moved into the temple complex is probably because it was such a large festival. It may have also been for emergencies or something like that, according to some of the commentaries that I read. But the point is that they are here as a convenience to the travelers for their sacrifices and their annual offerings. Now, these sacrifices, when you need to make a sacrifice, you need to bring a proper animal, unblemished, perfect in every way, so on and so forth. The oxen and sheep were for the more wealthy people who could afford to buy them. Doves, as we see in Leviticus, are given to the poor who can't afford an ox or a sheep to sacrifice, so it is a proper sacrifice for someone who is poor. The annual offering is a half shekel that every Jewish male, 20 and older, would pay to the temple. Now, they're exchanging coins here because there was one particular coin that was acceptable where all others weren't, and some people will say that that's because all these other coins had images on them, but the coin that was used, well, it was the Tyrian stater, also known as the tetradrachm, and it looked like this, and it has an image on there of a human, obviously, and a bird, and this human is, from the research I did, is the god Melkart, a god of Tyre, and it was prized for its purity of silver and its accuracy of weight. Not because it didn't have an image on it, because it obviously did. Now, where exactly in the temple were they is the question I want to look at, and don't worry about being able to not read the words here. I can't even read them on this picture, but I pulled this up to show you what's going on here. They would have been either here and or over there in the temple complex where I've outlined the sides. This is also called the Court of the Gentiles. That is as close as a Gentile could get to the temple of God. There were, of course, some Gentile believers called God-fearers. From what I've read in my research, these God-fearers believed in Yahweh, but they weren't circumcised, so they couldn't actually be called Jews in that case. So I don't know if those God-fearers could have gotten any closer or not, but I don't think they would have been able to. There's also a court of women, which is a little closer, and then a court of the Israelites, which would be the male Israelites. That's even closer, and then of course the priests and Levites could get even closer, with the high priest being the only one going into the Holy of Holies. But all of that in detail, I think, is something for another video. Now, it is often assumed in various texts that I have read that the money changers and those selling the animals were cheating people, which, I mean, don't get me wrong, human nature and whatnot, and we do know that some people did cheat other people out of money, but that may not have been going on. You know, I can't say for sure one way or the other whether it was or wasn't, but I don't think that is the purpose of what Jesus was doing this for. They shouldn't have been in the temple complex selling these things and exchanging money. That should have taken place outside the temple complex so that the temple complex could be used for holier purposes. Moving on, he made a whip of cords and he overturned some tables. So what's going on here? Is Jesus being overly violent or what? I don't think he's being violent at all. One of the commentaries I read said that he made this whip out of fodder for animals, so cords versus fodder, I don't think there's a big difference there. Either way, it's not going to hurt when you hit somebody with it. But if you use it to drive out animals, then it's going to be a very useful tool, and anyone who has tried to herd or drive animals somewhere without the aid of an implement or, say, dogs or something like that will tell you that it's exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, to get them to move without doing something to that effect. Now, this could also be to get people's attention. Some of the commentaries I read said that this is more a symbol of his righteous indignation, some sort of act kind of like one of the prophets of old, in the style of, not necessarily an actual replication of. There is a bit of disagreement on how to translate the Greek text too. As you saw in our text, it talked about him driving the people out, which made it seem like he was using the whip on people. But in the Greek text, it just says that he drove out both the sheep and the oxen, so it doesn't seem like he used the whip on the people themselves. Of course, overturning the tables would get people's attention. I do want to note, if he had been doing something overly riotous, shall we say, that the guards in the Antonia fortress, just a few steps away, would have come down and done something about it as well. And of course, he didn't set the doves free. He told people to take them and get them out of there. Again, doves being for the poor, there's no reason to set them free, because then the poor wouldn't be able to have a sacrifice. And he wasn't destroying property or stealing or anything like that. Now, what we could be seeing here is a reflection of Malachi 3:1-6, which talks about the Lord coming suddenly on the temple and cleansing his people, refining his priests, is the way that the text puts it, and coming in judgment. I kind of think that Malachi 3:1-6 is mostly talking about the second coming. I could be wrong. We'll look more into that when we get to Malachi. But just a first off read, that's kind of what I'm getting from that, although there is also the possibility of dual fulfillment. So this would be a softer fulfillment, whereas the second coming would be more of a harsh fulfillment. Verses 7 and following of Malachi 3 there do talk about people robbing from God as well. So if the sellers and exchangers were cheating people, they would then be robbing from God. Although they are robbing from God in the sense of being in a place where people should be to worship, not to buy and sell. We also have, I think, a bit of a reflection of Zechariah 14:21, as some of my commentaries pointed out. In here, it talks about how there will no longer be a traitor in the house of Yahweh on the day of the Lord. Though some translations will say a Canaanite, not a traitor, so that doesn't make much sense here. That may be something to look at when we get to Zechariah. And the day of the Lord itself is also something that I want to talk about in another video. It definitely deserves a whole video, if not maybe a 2 or 3 part series of videos on it. Now, what about this idea of my father's house and turning it into a marketplace? Well, by saying my father's house, he is claiming uniquely to be the Son of God. Jews would not have said Yahweh is my father. They may have said Yahweh is our father, but not my father. So Jesus here is definitely making a distinction between him and the Jews, and we see this come up again in John chapter 8, where because he claims God as his father, he's making himself equal to God, so they pick up stones to stone him. And again, we'll talk about that when we get to John chapter 8. He also, in John chapter 8, by the way, calls them sons of their father, the devil. So, big difference between God being your father and the devil being your father. Calling this a marketplace is a much nicer way of putting it in this particular cleansing than what he says in the second cleansing, but we'll talk about that when we get to it in the other Gospels. This first cleansing is more about reform, and the second cleansing seems to be more about judgment. But again, we'll go over that when we get to the other Gospels. This does, however, bring up the question, was there one cleansing or two? Because some people will say that there was just one cleansing. However, if there was just one cleansing, then who moved it and why? If there are two cleansings, why didn't it work the first time, and why doesn't everyone mention two? Well, for the first part here, as to who moved it and why, some people will say that John took it and moved it to the beginning of Jesus' ministry for theological reasons, basically stating, this is the guy that not only saves us from our sins, but he also cleanses God's people, cleanses God's way of being worshipped. And as far as the second one, let's admit it, most of us are pretty hard-headed and tend to forget things and go back to our old ways, especially if this was a one-off and happened, say, a few years ago, and people do it again, and then Jesus comes in and cleans it out again, it makes sense. Now, why don't all the accounts mention 2? Well, you have to remember that writing was expensive back then, and they were writing for a specific purpose, and if it didn't fit their purpose to put in one or the other, then there's really no need to. These aren't full-on biographies trying to give us every single detail about the life of Jesus. They're trying to get across the good news, aka the gospel, because that's literally what it means, and they're trying to do it in a way that is going to focus on events and teachings that will touch the hearts and minds of the people they're writing to, and not mentioning those that won't have any effect, or won't have as much of effect as they would like. Not being deceitful or anything like that, just being smart and efficient about the space and time that they have, and getting the most bang for their buck, so to speak, with this evidence. I personally think the best solution is that there were 2 cleansings, one at the beginning and one at the end. Of course, there could have been more, but we don't have those recorded for us, so we have no way of knowing that. Now, what about this consuming zeal? Well, this passage comes from Psalm 69:9, which states, "Because zeal for your house has consumed me." In our passage here in John, it says, "will consume me," not "has consumed me." So there's obviously a change from past tense to future tense. I looked high and low. I looked in the Masoretic text. I looked in the Septuagint text. I couldn't find a version of Psalm 69:9 that had a future tense verb in it for this particular passage. The commentaries that I read stated that they think this may have been a reaction to what had just happened with the cleansing, so they would have read it as a messianic psalm saying this is going to happen, and it did happen. Who knows? Maybe that's how it went. And of course, they may not have remembered it on the spot either. What I do think is interesting, though, is that the Apostle Paul uses the second half of Psalm 69:9 in Romans 5:13. Now this says, "And the insults of those who insult you have fallen on me." So it seems highly unlikely that 2 different authors would use 2 halves of the same verse to give a testimony about the Messiah. This would imply, I believe, and my commentaries were saying this, that this psalm was being used pretty early on by the Christians as a messianic psalm. With that, we're going to end this video. In the next one, don't forget we're going to talk about the death and resurrection prophecy that Jesus gives in the last half here. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and leave us a comment letting me know what you thought, things I could do better, and things to focus on. If you think this would be useful for your family, friends, or church group, please share it with them. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe and hit that bell notification icon so you know when I upload a new video. Don't forget to email me any questions you may have, either over this text or anything else related to the Bible, God, and Christianity. And until next time, bring on the doubts, because you are always welcomed.